I see a little starting event. Good evening, everyone. I'm not sure if you heard those last few seconds, but welcome to this, the first in a new series of public lectures hosted by Aberystwyth University and funded by the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, Aberystwyth has a long tradition of public lectures which address contemporary challenges. And this is both part of that tradition, but also going off in a new direction. Technology allows us now to host these events online. Eventually, we hope when regulations permit that they will be in a hybrid form, both in the flesh in Aberystwyth and online. But this is an exciting opportunity for us to bring audiences from across Wales, across the UK, and more widely to hear some of the fantastic lecturers who we have speaking at Aberystwyth. My name is Colin McInnes. I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research, Knowledge Exchange and Innovation, and I also hold a personal chair in international politics at the university. And with me tonight is Dr. Ellen Royals, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of International Politics. And Ellen will be monitoring questions through the evening. So if you do have a question, please use the chat function to ask the question. The questions can be in either English or in Welsh, though the answers will only be in the medium of English. Please, a personal plea from my perspective, no questions on the European Super League. I think we've had quite enough about that recently, and metaphors about failed European initiatives, I think we can all take as read. So no questions on the European Super League. Sorry about that. So finally, in these introductory comments, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Anand Menon. Anand is the Professor of European Policy and Foreign Affairs at King's College London and is also an Associate Fellow at the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Chatham House. Anand's held previous posts at the Universities of Oxford and Birmingham and is author of a wide range of publications, most recently the book Brexit and British Politics, and perhaps most pertinently for this lecture. He is also director of the ESRC UK in a Change in Europe programme, and this is an initiative by the ESRC to try and bring academic research into the wider public discourse on Brexit and the future of the UK and Europe. Personally speaking, I think this is a total and utter waste of money because Anand has been doing this all of his career. He has been one of the most effective and articulate commentators on European politics that the UK has. And for that reason, if no other, it's fantastic that he's able to deliver this lecture tonight. You may have seen him on Question Time. You may have heard him on the news quiz. But I think the highest praise that I can give is that a few years ago, he was speaking on College Green during some of the Brexit votes in the House of Parliament opposite College Green. And once he'd finished, my daughter, who was watching this with me, turned to me and said, "He's rather good, isn't he?" And I think that just about sums up the effect that Anand Menon has had on the public discourse on Brexit. That this is one of the leading commentators which we in the UK have, talking about one of the most pressing issues which we face. So Anand, it's my great pleasure to invite you to deliver tonight's lecture. Anand.
Thank you very much, Colin. Thank you very much, Colin's daughter. And thank you very much to the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales. I'll start with a confession, which makes me rather sad about this lecture, and the confession is I've never, ever been to Aberystwyth. And I did at one point, think to myself, when it looked like we were sort of out of COVID, that this might be possible in person, but it turns out not to be. But I do intend to get there one day. So, Colin, you're not off the hook for the post-lecture dinner. We'll just do it several months post-lecture, if that's okay. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is what Brexit might mean, I suppose, for the United Kingdom. I'm hoping my slides might come up at some point. I can't see them on the screen. Oh, perfect. Thank you very much indeed. And the outline of what I'm going to do is here. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Trade and Cooperation Agreement means and argue that actually Brexit isn't over. We have locked ourselves in if geography hadn't already done that for us, into a set of permanent negotiations with the European Union. And we'll talk briefly about what the economic impact on the United Kingdom might be, what it means for the politics. I'm going to chat briefly about devolution, Scotland and Wales in particular, and touch on foreign policy and transatlantic relations and what Brexit might mean for them. And I've set myself the ambitious target of trying to do all that in about 40 or 45 minutes. So we've got plenty of time for your questions afterwards. So without further ado, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is a very big, very complicated agreement. I think the starting point for any discussion of it is going to be far less disruptive than a no-deal outcome to the Brexit process would have been. If you think back to last December, there were moments in that month where it looked like agreement would not be reached. So whatever criticisms there are to be made of the TCA, and Lord knows there are criticisms to be made of the TCA, it's worth comparing it to what was come December last year, the only feasible alternative, which was no deal at all. A no deal wouldn't just have added tariffs and quotas to the costs of doing business between the UK and the EU. It would also, I think, have led to a very, very quick and severe breakdown in political relations between the UK and the EU member states. Both sides would have blamed the other for failure. Both sides would have engaged in mutual recriminations. The rhetoric would have ramped up because that's inherent in the nature of politics, that you want to blame someone else for what is immediate chaos at your borders. And it would have been very, very hard to row back from that position. So the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is a massive improvement in terms of our relationship with the European Union to the only other place those relations could have gone last year. That being said, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement doesn't cover everything. There are some bits that the British government left out because it wanted to. Foreign policy is one, and I'll come back to the implications of that later on. Services is another, and I'll talk about that when I talk about the economic implications of the deal. But there are some issues that are still to be resolved. Financial services and the exchange of data are both awaiting unilateral EU decisions on whether or not to grant us, respectively, equivalence and adequacy, which will allow a greater degree of cross-border exchange than if neither of those decisions are given. On financial services in particular, it's worth saying that equivalence would not be the same as membership, but it would be an improvement on a situation where there is no equivalence and make financial services trade slightly easier. So that's the first thing. We're waiting for a whole set of decisions from the European Union. My guess, for what it's worth, is we're not going to get very far with equivalence, not least because the UK Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, is very fond of saying we are going to make use of our new regulatory freedoms to allow us to compete more effectively with places like the European Union. When the European Union hear this, they think, well, in that case, why should we give you equivalence? Because if you're simply going to use your newfound Brexit freedoms to try and undercut us in regulatory terms, why should we make it easier for you? The second tranche of issues that will haunt the future, I think, is the simple fact that we have to figure out how to make this enormous treaty work. Now, first and most obviously, there is an ongoing disagreement between the two sides about the protocol. Those of you who watched Boris Johnson's comments on that programme last night will realise that the British government is still not ready fully to accept what it signed up to with the protocol in terms of the checks that EU law demand. But unless some way can be found of making the protocol work, then the danger is that we slide into court action. And in extremis, if the European Union thinks that we are failing to implement the terms of the agreement, they can suspend application of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement in its entirety. So making this work, putting the committee structure in place that the TCA sets up, 19 separate institutions to govern the workings of the deal, and then moving forward, making sure it works as implemented, by which I mean there are all sorts of ways under the treaty in which a perceived breach by one side, particularly of regulatory standards, can lead to the imposition of tariffs by the other. So this doesn't settle things once and for all. It provides a baseline, but we can still enter a world of one side imposing tariffs on the other in the event that that side thinks that the other has undercut them on some regulations. One concrete example to give is the Chancellor announced the creation of free ports in the budget. We wait with interest to see what the regulations around free ports are, but there is a chance, albeit a slim one, that the European Union looks at what we do and sees that as unfair regulatory competition and decides to take remedial action under the treaty. And the final thing, of course, as if that weren't enough, is that there is provision in the treaty for a periodic review of it. Both sides therefore have the ability to walk away from it should they so wish, but they can also revisit some of its terms and negotiate again. So Brexit is over, but Brexit will continue for the foreseeable future. But what does Brexit mean in practical terms? Well, I'm going to talk you through the economics. If you want to ask questions afterwards about forecasts and what they mean and what they don't mean, I'm very happy to field those. Forecasts should always be taken with a pinch of salt, but they give us some idea of what is going on. And the first study I want to look at is this, which has been done by the Centre for European Reform. John Springford is the economist there who's done this work. And what they've tried to do is model what the impact of Brexit has been to date. They've updated this. I apologize, I haven't updated this chart, but that gap, 2.5%, is now slightly bigger than it was back in 2018. But what they do is they take a group of economies that have historically performed like the UK economy. And so you can see that the two lines up to the referendum stay very close together. And then they project forward. And the conclusion they've come to is that by this point in 2018, UK GDP was 2.5% lower than it would have been without the referendum. And remember, this is without anything effectively having happened. We hadn't left the single market, we hadn't left the customs union, we were still in fact a member state at this point, and yet you have this gap. And their argument is this gap is caused by two things. One, a slight readjustment of trade, as perhaps people in the European Union started fearing uncertainty because of Brexit and looking for non-UK based suppliers or non-UK based markets. But more specifically, I think, a fall off in investment as companies put investment plans on hold, decided we better wait and see what happens with Brexit before we invest that money. There is the potential, of course, now, particularly with the end of COVID and lockdown, that some of that investment will come back and will be included in the post-COVID bounce that we're all expecting to see. But in aggregate terms, looking forward, these are the numbers on what we expect from the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. The figures on the left are what the deal leaves us with. The figures on the right are the additional costs that no deal would have given us on top of that. And the figures are quite stark. Minus 6% of income per capita, an enormous drop in exports and imports. The simple argument here is Brexit at heart is about making trade with our nearest and largest trading partner more difficult, more administratively cumbersome, and more expensive. And that will have impacts on trade because people who now trade across that border might think actually the costs have become prohibitive. Either the costs of the amounts of paperwork you need to fill in, the costs of seeking compliance with EU standards, as we have to do for everything. Now we're outside the single market. Economists expect a significant fall in trade. And actually, when it comes to the recent ONS figures on trade, it's interesting. There's two things that are worth pointing out. First, there is definitely a Brexit effect, whatever you might hear to the contrary. And the simple argument for that is trade with the rest of the world has rebounded to pre-pandemic levels. Trade with the European Union has not. But secondly, it's an unequal Brexit effect because we're currently in a rather weird situation where the UK government has not imposed any of the checks on EU exports to the UK. So EU exporters are having a ball. They can continue to export without their goods being checked to the borders because we haven't put the checks in place, whereas the UK applies the full panoply of checks to UK exporters. So we have a very asymmetric Brexit at the moment. If you're a UK exporter exporting to the European Union, you face additional costs. If you're an EU exporter exporting to the United Kingdom, you don't face any of those costs. But we'd expect as those checks are brought in next year that actually imports into the United Kingdom will suffer the same sort of impact as exports from the United Kingdom have suffered already. And to give you some sense of this, because, you know, it's hard to sort of get a handle on what these numbers mean. If we think about the costs of Brexit relative to the costs of COVID, then over the medium term, and it's the light blue line you should be looking at, the costs of Brexit with this free trade agreement that we have signed will be, I mean, my eyes are failing me, but 2 to 3 times the size of the aggregate impact of COVID. COVID will have an enormous short-term impact, is having an enormous short-term impact, but most economists expect the economy to bounce back fairly quickly from that. I'll come back to this point later. The interesting thing about that graph for me is this might mean that ultimately COVID serves to cover some of the economic impacts of Brexit from the population, making the political impact of the economics of Brexit far less severe, I think, than many people have argued that they will be. I just want to talk briefly about where these costs come from so we understand it. This is a leaked government analysis, leaked in 2017 to BuzzFeed, as I recall. The diagonal blue lines below the line are the costs imposed by non-tariff barriers. So firstly, do not buy into the story that we're not paying tariffs, so things are fine, because the majority of costs associated with Brexit are the costs of non-tariff barriers. The other thing worth bearing in mind about this graph is if you look above the line, above 0%, that's made up of two things. A tiny sliver, which are the government's estimates of the benefits economically to be had from the freedom to regulate as we choose. That is what control gives us in an economic sense. I mean, it's worth saying that control was valued in its own right as a political thing rather than an economic thing by many people. But economically, it, to say the least, does not make up for the negative impact of Brexit. And the second sliver above the line is the expected economic impact of trade deals being signed with all those countries listed at the bottom. So yes, Liz Truss is being hyperactive. Yes, trade deals are being signed. But what those names under the line, US, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Brunei, China, etc., tell you is geography still matters. Many of those are very big economies, but they're a long, long way away. So even if we sign trade deals with them, that's not going to make up for the loss of trade caused by imposing these checks on trade with our largest and nearest trading partner. So much for the economics. I think the takeaway from this is the economic impact will be severe, but it's an economic impact that will play out over time. If you want a metaphor for the economic impact of Brexit, I would not use the term cliff edge, which so many people have used, because that's not how it'll work. I would prefer, I think, to use the term slow puncture, which captures the fact that the economics of Brexit will play out over a decade or more. It might be in 10 years' time, we look back and we look at ourselves and we look at the French and think, something funny is going on here. But the other thing, there are two defining features of a slow puncture. Firstly, it takes you ages to figure out when you pick the slow puncture up, which means that actually, well, firstly, it takes you ages to notice you've got a slow puncture. So it might be a while before we notice. But secondly, it takes you, it's very, very hard to figure out where you got that slow puncture, which means in 10, 12 years' time, it will not be necessarily straightforward to argue that sluggish British growth compared to the European Union, if that is indeed the case, was down to the decision to leave the European Union. So I want to turn now to the politics of all of this. And the first thing to bear in mind is the economics of Brexit might not necessarily have a political impact. If you look at this, this is basically a graph charting the fact that an increasingly large proportion of the population thought that Brexit would make us less well off. Okay, so it was down to minus 28% by June 2020. That's the gap between people who thought we'd be better off and people who thought would be less well off. So even amongst some leavers now, there is a sense that Brexit involves economic costs. However, whilst there has been some movement in this YouGov monthly tracker, there hasn't been that much of a swing away from, in that period between when the Brexit is a wrong decision, the sort of orangey line goes on, is on top. The gap is never that big, and certainly not as big as you might think it would be if you thought people thought the economic consequences were all that mattered. There are a couple of reasons for that, I think. One, the switch around from good decision to bad decision was partly made up of the fact that people who couldn't vote in 2016 are now surveyed in this YouGov tracker because they're now 18, and the majority of those people now say they think it was a bad decision to leave. But the second thing is many leavers either don't believe in the economic data or think that a fall in GDP is not something they should worry about because aggregates don't impact on their day-to-day life, or, and this is true in a significant number of cases, are willing to pay an economic price to leave the European Union. So there's no automatic relationship between the economics of Brexit and the positives. What there is, though, without a shadow of a doubt, is the fact that Brexit has triggered a different division in our politics to the one that used to characterize party competition. Our politics used to be divided, structured by class. So the left-right dimension of politics between people arguing about levels of taxation, levels of investment, levels of redistribution was what dominated voter choice. Brexit has forefronted another division in British society, and it's a division, broadly speaking, between social liberals and social conservatives, a completely different division in society. Now, pollsters use all sorts of ways to get to those questions of social values, whether it's asking about the death penalty or asking about attitudes to gender equality, gay rights, all those kinds of issues. But the Brexit divide, as you can see from this graph in front of you, correlated with this values divide. The more socially conservative you are, the more likely you are to have voted for Brexit. And that has been responsible for some of the weirdness we've seen in recent elections. We found ourselves having to wrestle with concepts we thought we'd never have to wrestle with, like Labour win Canterbury, or the Tories win Stoke, or Labour win Kensington. Those sorts of things wouldn't happen if this was a simple, straightforward fight between left and right. They're happening because it is also now, and some would argue predominantly now, a battle between social liberals and social conservatives. Now, Brexit has changed us in the sense that it has entrenched these new identities with around 30% of people now saying that they have strong Remain and Leave identities. These identities have become entrenched. There's been some fascinating survey work done by Sarah Hobolt at the LSE, who found, for instance, in some experimental work she did about 2 or 3 years ago, that over 50% of Remainers said they would be reluctant to rent a room in their house to a Leave voter. I think it was about 55% of Remainers said they would be quite or very upset if one of their kids were to marry a Leave voter. So these divisions show every sign of being quite entrenched. Interestingly enough, one of the things that has blurred our attitudes towards the European Union in recent times has been the row over vaccines. The row over vaccines, if you look at the bottom right-hand table, you'll see that 49% of Remainers think that the vaccination programme has been better here because the UK is no longer a member of the European Union. I personally don't think that's true, but it speaks to the fact that actually for a Conservative government that was elected largely at the head of a Leave coalition in December 2019. I think 82% of those who voted Tory in the last election were Brexit supporters, according to BES data. Having the vaccine argument with the European Union and having the tremendous, at least for the moment, relative success of our rollout of the vaccine compared to theirs has been massively useful for the government. Now, this is useful in all sorts of ways for the government. Obviously, it's useful as we run in towards the elections coming up in May, where we expect the Tories to do very well indeed. But it's also useful for the government because of the nature of the party coalitions that now exist in the United Kingdom. This is work that's based on a series of surveys of party members, of party activists, of MPs, and of voters. And what this four-dimensional space shows is on the left to right is the left to right axis of politics. The vertical axis is social liberal versus authoritarian social values. And what we've tried to do is to figure out how coherent the party coalitions are around these issues. And what you'll see from this is, relatively speaking, it's all relative, the Conservatives are pretty united when it comes to values. That's to say, the gap there between MPs and voters is relatively small vertically. It is big particularly when you come to look at those 2019 Labour to Conservative switches when it comes to economic policy. What this speaks to is the fact that the government is quite keen that the values division in British politics remains salient. It is in the interest of the government that there is a sort of low-level crackling tension between the United Kingdom and the European Union, because the coalition they created back in December 2019 likes that sort of tension. It's one of the reasons why I think that going forward, relations between the UK and the EU aren't going to settle into some easy equilibrium. I think there will always be tensions, and the clearest example of that is the argument that the British government has started over the status of the EU ambassador in London. The UK government is refusing to give the EU ambassador the full status of a state ambassador. It works for them politically, and that has to be, in my book, one of the reasons why this argument has been confected. The contrast with Labour is quite stark here. For Labour, if you look at the gulf between MPs and 2019 Labour to Tory switches on values, that's a very, very hard issue for Labour to deal with. It's one of the reasons why you see a Keir Starmer, talking about patriotism, talking about the flag, talking about those sort of things. He's trying to bridge that gap between the Labour Party and the voters that the Labour Party wins back. If you heard Prime Minister's questions today, you'd have heard the Prime Minister alleging incorrectly in response to a question that a Labour MP had said that she was embarrassed by this country. But that's exactly the sort of touchstone issue the Tories want to keep talking about. They like talking about statues. They like talking about free speech in universities. They like talking about immigration. They like talking about Brexit, because those are all the kinds of issues that mobilise that values division, where not only are they relatively united, but Labour is relatively divided. For Labour, the key is to try and make the terrain of politics the terrain of economics. If we look here, this is the Ipsos Mori salience tracker of issues. Obviously, coronavirus is top now. What Labour will be hoping and praying is that that red line goes away and that line marked economy, or particularly unemployment, start to become issues again in the public mind, so that they can talk about left versus right. They can talk about a generous state under the Labour versus something else under the Conservatives, and they can talk about Boris Johnson's competence at managing the economy. I would suggest that the key issue confronting the country going forward is what will be the terrain of the next election. Are we still going to be arguing about values, in which case the Conservatives have an inbuilt advantage, or are we going to be talking about the economics? And I suspect a lot of this and a lot of the fate of the political parties is going to hinge on what happens to unemployment post-pandemic. Economists have been revising down their forecasts of unemployment levels post-pandemic, but the speed and efficiency with which the government tackles that, I think, is going to be key. Because if there's one economic issue that the public opinion reacts to, historically, it has been unemployment. I remember Harold Wilson famously said, unemployment is either 0 or 100%. So it's either something we're not talking about at all, which has been the case in the recent past, or it's the only thing we're talking about. And that, I think, is going to be the fundamental issue as we move into the next general election. You bear with me a sec, I'll just grab a glass of water. I'm not in Wales, but as some of you might be in Wales, and it's a lecture hosted by an institution in Wales, I wanted to talk a little bit about what all this means for the devolved nations. You'd have seen in the papers today some quite striking polling about Northern Ireland. Across the devolved nations, Brexit has perturbed the sort of map of public opinion and public attitudes. You see that in Northern Ireland with attitudes towards whether or not the island will be united and whether or not people want it to be united. I would suggest that in Northern Ireland, the key issue in the short term, apart from dealing with the violence that's been breaking out, is finding a way of making the protocol work. If the protocol can be made to work, and in particular, if it can be made to work in such a way as to keep the unionist population satisfied as well. And if it can be made to work, as some people involved in the signing of the Northern Ireland Protocol were convinced it could, to give Northern Ireland the best of both worlds, the EU market and the UK market, then I think things might calm down in Northern Ireland. If, however, the current contestation over the protocol keeps on going, I suspect we're in for a very, very rocky period in the province. Turning now to Scotland. Scotland, of course, voted to remain. Scotland, of course, was very noisy in trying to suggest alternatives to the direction Mrs. May was taking when it came to Brexit, and found themselves sort of systematically ignored during that whole process. The whole process of the Brexit negotiations under Theresa May, there's a profound sense, both on the part of the Scottish and the Welsh governments, that their views were simply not being taken into account. And this is one of the reasons, if not the reason, why in Scotland you see this trend, which is from during the Brexit process, a steady rise in support for independence. This rise has been accounted for largely, I think, by the fact that many Scottish Remainers who might have been anti-independence in 2014 have shifted over to be pro-independent, either in reaction to what they see as the way Scotland has been treated, or in some cases because they see Scottish independence as their route to rejoining the European Union. What I would caution about this is that I think, on the one hand, Brexit strengthened the emotional case for Scottish independence. It made it very easy. And of course, subsequently, the perceived success of Nicola Sturgeon at dealing with the COVID crisis has done the same thing. But it was very easy post-Brexit for the SNP to argue the English are dragging you out of the European Union against your will. The flip side is that Brexit has the potential to make the practical case for independence far more complex and messy than it was. Scottish independence in the context of the UK's membership of the European Union would have been relatively easy to manage in a practical sense, because there would have been no need for a border between Scotland and England. Scottish independence, and particularly Scottish independence with EU membership, post-Brexit and post the kind of Brexit that Boris Johnson has negotiated, will necessitate a discussion about the kind of border we need between Scotland and England, because of course the Scottish-English border will be an external EU border. Now, one of the problems with this is you end up with the hideous Groundhog Day, where proponents of Scottish independence use the arguments that proponents of Brexit use to argue there is no need for a border anywhere in the island of Ireland. We can use technology, the EU are being unreasonable, all those sorts of things. The one fundamental difference, and it's absolutely fundamental, I think, if we end up having a debate about Scottish independence, the one fundamental difference between Scotland and Northern Ireland, if it came to a discussion about EU borders, is this. Northern Ireland is a special case for the European Union. It's a special case because the European Union is a signatory to the Good Friday Agreement. It's a special case because during the Brexit negotiations, the Republic argued successfully that its vital national interests were at play, and so the EU had to show a degree of flexibility over Northern Ireland in order to protect those vital national interests, which is why Ireland has ended up in this weird and unique position with regard to the UK and the EU economies. None of that applies to Scotland, and I find it inconceivable that the European Union would allow for the sort of special status for Scotland that they've granted for Northern Ireland, which in turn means that the debate about the border will be a tricky one for the SNP. Just to reinforce, if you want to have a quick look at that, the point about independence driven by Remain voters, that these are people who are very hostile to Brexit, while supporting independence. Incidentally, I'm very, very happy to share these slides afterwards with people. If they want, I can email them over. Now, hand on heart, and to be perfectly honest with you, I know very, very little about Welsh politics. I've got a horrible feeling there are loads of people in the audience who know loads about it. So I'm going to rattle through about 2.5 minutes on Wales and hope you don't notice any mistakes I make. One of the interesting things about Wales has been the rating and standing of Mark Drakeford. The red line is the percentage of people who said they didn't know who he was. The blue line is basically how well he's doing, a rating of how well he's doing. That's a very positive set of numbers if you're Mark Drakeford. The problem for him, and you've got to feel a little bit sorry for him given these numbers, is that it hasn't seemed really to have translated into increased electoral support for a number of reasons. Partly because the Tories are getting a little bit of a bounce because of the perceived success of the national vaccine rollout. For those who've noticed Mark Drakeford and have supported what the Welsh government has done, for some of them at least, this is evidence of the fact that Wales needs more autonomy from England, if not independence. So you have a strange situation in the run-up to the elections at the start of May, that Mark Drakeford is generally thought to have performed very well. There's been a slight downtick in that, of course, since the vaccine rollout. But he hasn't seemed to have been able to reap the electoral rewards of it, at least not in the polling. I should say, actually, one thing that's very, very important to say whenever you talk about these elections coming up are weird in a whole number of ways. Firstly, by the sheer number of elections we've got, which is we haven't seen the like of it before, because of course we are dealing with not just the elections that were scheduled, but also catching up on the elections that were cancelled because of COVID, but also because of the temporal moment at which we're having them. At the moment when we're all starting to, the British people are thinking more about pubs than politics at the moment, because they're being allowed to go to them either now or in the near future. And of course, we've got the success of the vaccine rollout. So there is a real issue about how generalizable these results are to anything in the future, because the next elections we have, and particularly the next general election, will be held in a very, very different context. Finally, there is support for Welsh independence. You have that one green dot miles above the others in 2021, which was that poll that put support at 35%. Still, you can see a bit of a drift in recent times, which I think is partly connected to that disturbance that I talked about that Brexit has implied to what were beforehand relatively settled attitudes about a number of things, not least the union and what it can deliver. Plaid obviously accounting on that one isolated green dot to build their support, but I suspect there's a lot more turbulence to come in terms of relations between London and the devolved capitals, particularly when it comes to making the internal market bill work. So there's scope for a hell of a lot more turbulence in public attitudes in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, I think, in the months to come. Good. That was the bit I was dreading. And one of the great things about Zoom is you can't see the audience rolling their eyes, for which I thank you all. I want to talk briefly and finally, before I round up, about foreign policy. Colin and I are old international relations hands, so I couldn't let this lecture finish without talking a little bit about foreign policy. Several things to say about Brexit and foreign policy, I think. The first is there is now no institutionalized foreign and defense policy relationship between the UK and the European Union. And the reason for this is quite simple. The political declaration that was largely negotiated by Theresa May, but ultimately approved by Boris Johnson, had a section about foreign and defense policy cooperation. And Boris Johnson, during the course of last year, simply announced he wasn't interested in taking it any further. He didn't want to talk about foreign and defense policy cooperation. Now, on the one hand, I would argue that that really doesn't matter all that much. And it doesn't matter all that much because EU foreign policy agreements with third countries don't tend to provide very much. They might give a link to the sort of small countries on Europe's periphery to foreign policy, which those countries like. But for a country the size and stature of the United Kingdom, which plays a key role in European security, there's nothing off the shelf that would provide the sort of impact or influence that a UK government would be looking for. And it's perfectly possible to collaborate in an informal way, even without formalised relations. However, the UK government has gone further than this. It's not just talking about the lack of need for a formalised, institutionalised relationship. The UK government has gone about foreign policy largely as if the European Union doesn't exist. It has dealt with individual member states, it's dealt with the individual groups of member states, the Visegrad states, or the so-called E3 primarily, which is the UK, France and Germany. And there's clearly a desire to work with member states rather than the European Union. And there's clearly a need for the UK to work with its European partners, whether it's a question of dealing with Russia or dealing with North Africa. Geography forces us to work together on shared interests and to confront common threats. One big question is whether or not this model of cooperation that the Johnson government seems intent on pursuing, of dealing with member states and not the European Union, will work. And I think there are two potential shortcomings here. The first is political, and it is that smaller member states, those excluded from the E3, will, I think, increasingly push back if it looks like the French, the Brits and the Germans are trying to sort foreign policy amongst themselves. And my suspicion, particularly with this French president, is if you get significant pushback from the medium side, from the Spanish, from the Italians. The Spanish and the Italians were very upset when the E3 was created, and it was initially created in 2002-3 to deal with negotiations with Iran. If there is significant pushback from other member states, then I suspect the French and the Germans will simply say to the UK, look, there are limits to how much we can do under this format. The second limitation is substantive and legal, which is it's fine talking to the French and Germans about military interventions and about dealing with Iran and about things that fall outside the competence of the European Union. But as soon as you're talking about things like sanctions, or particularly if you're talking about things like climate, then actually the EU has competence, and dealing with the European Union is far more effective and efficient than dealing with individual member states. Now, one of the things that the Boris Johnson government, I think, is starting to find is that despite all the early talk about tensions between the Biden administration and the UK because of Brexit, because of things that have been said about President Obama, the UK and the US share a large substantive agenda when it comes to foreign policy. Iran, Russia, multilateralism, reinforcing Western security via NATO, dealing with China. The UK, I should say in parentheses, is far closer to the US position on China than the European Union is, and climate change. So in substantive terms, there is a lot that the UK and the US can do together. However, it is quite possible that President Biden will come to feel that he wants his two closest Western allies to play together nicely. That is to say, it's not inconceivable. There is a significant amount of pressure from the White House on both the EU and the UK to work together more closely on some of those issues, because that will make the maintenance of Western unity far easier. And remember, foreign policy this year at least is a very, very big deal for the United Kingdom. We hold the chairmanship of the Security Council, the chairmanship of the G7, and jointly with Italy, which isn't a phrase you'll read in the press, but it's true, we chair the COP26 UN Environmental Summit. It's a year when the UK is desperate to make a splash on the world stage, not least because Boris Johnson wants to show that Brexit doesn't mean any decrease in international influence. Because of that, I think there are particular pressures on him to make foreign policy work. And there, I think, increasingly over time, he will start to sense a need to work with the European Union, perhaps a little bit more closely than he'd wanted to, either for substantive functional reasons or because the United States are putting pressure on the government to do so. So finally, in conclusion, I see from my little timer, I'm almost at 40 minutes. What can we draw from all of this? It's all quite tentative in the sense that Brexit is one of those things that keeps changing in terms of the process and in terms of its potential implications. But I think the one thing I can say with a fair degree of certainty is Brexit isn't over. One way or another, and as I said right at the start, we are neighbours, geographical neighbours. You know, that almost by itself ensures that we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about the European Union. The Canadians and the Mexicans spend an awful lot of time thinking about the United States. God knows China's neighbors spend an inordinate amount of time thinking, or in many cases worrying, about China. We will have to spend a lot of time thinking about the European Union because it's a massive presence on our doorstep, and particularly on economic matters. The EU as a regulatory entity wields an enormous amount of power and influence. But over and above that, there is the fact that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement locks us in to what looks increasingly like a permanent set of negotiations with the European Union. Remember those 19 committees that are going to have to be staffed and are going to have to deal with a lot of the day-to-day workings of the treaty. We will be negotiating with the European Union in one way, shape or form for the foreseeable future. And the impacts of that, whether on our politics, whether on our constitution and the devolution settlements, and whether on our economics, are going to continue to resonate for a very long time to come. I said in the introduction to a big report that we put out in December called Brexit and Beyond, that Brexit in a way is like chucking a big stone into a very flat, calm pond. And those ripples are going to keep being seen for years, if not decades. One big question, and I think you could probably get a sense of it from the lecture, is, and it's the one that really sort of fascinates me, is the degree to which Brexit continues to haunt our politics. I've tried to argue that the government has an interest in it continuing to haunt our politics because that's home turf for a government that has created a sort of social values electoral coalition, but a lot will hinge on what happens to the economy going forward. And finally, international implications. I'm not that fussed about the lack of a treaty with the European Union. I'm far more concerned about the fact that the EU and the UK discover ways of working together on matters of shared interest that, in functional terms at least, allow them to achieve everything that they need to achieve to combat shared threats and to deal with shared challenges, not least the climate emergency. And I'll leave it there if that's all right. This is the moment when I find out if anyone's awake. Colin, are you awake?
I certainly am.
Okay, good.
And thank you, Anna. That was fantastic. So Ellen has been monitoring the chat and the questions, and she's joining us on the celebrity squares here. So Ellen, over to you, unless you want me to ask the first question.
I think we've had a range of questions coming in already, and including from current students and from alumni. I think you mentioned that we'll try and go through a lot of them, so let's go for it. I think in the order that we've received them. So Mark Heslop asks, Boris Johnson seems to be pushing a green agenda, trying to become a leader fighting global climate change. How is it possible to address growth in non-EU trade with trading countries further afield? If we import more from America's Asia, surely the transport costs are just going to keep escalating. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, the transport costs are obviously higher, which is one of the reasons why actually I think that trade with the US or China, whoever, as I tried to argue in the lecture, will never replace EU trade. Those volumes will remain much smaller. But yeah, absolutely. There are environmental implications for this. I think the big question about Boris Johnson's environmental credentials for me is this. As I've said, this is a massive year for foreign policy. Chairing the COP26 is the centerpiece of the government's agenda for this year. I mean, maybe joint top with the G7 in Cornwall in June. Boris Johnson wants to make a splash, which is why they've tightened they've increased their targets now. The UK wants to be seen as an example for other countries because what Boris Johnson really wants is for that summit to be a roaring success. Okay? What I'm not clear about is how great a priority climate will be when COP26 is in the rearview mirror. That is to say, I'm still not convinced. I mean, I could be convinced. This isn't a sort of inherent skepticism. This is I genuinely don't know how much of this, in other words, is performative. Boris Johnson's a very good performative politician, and he'll be at his peak as a performative politician at the summit in November in front of other world leaders, and he'll have a line on climate change and the climate emergency. But the proof of the pudding is going to be the degree to which what he says to other countries is enshrined in binding domestic law and the degree to which the government starts to act on quite ambitious targets it set itself, which are going to impose some rather difficult choices on the government itself and on us as people living in this country.
Super, thank you. Another question that's come in from Sam Rogers, and this was linked more to the kind of devolution aspects and the implications in different parts of the UK. Do you think it's possible that the UK will still exist within its territorial boundaries in 20 years' time? Has the UK's vote to sovereignty risked its existence as a sovereign state? By Sam Rogers.
Well, yes and yes, I suppose my short answers to those questions. Yes, I can conceive of a way the UK exists within its current boundaries in 20 years' time. It's far from a foregone conclusion either that we're going to have a united Ireland or an independent Scotland within that time period. But has Brexit sort of shaken the kaleidoscope of constitutional politics? Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. Think back to just how bad-tempered interactions within the Intergovernmental Committee was under Theresa May, to the fury that greets the way in which Boris Johnson is seen in the devolved to sort of trample over their interests. There is a tension there now, and that tension, is quite possibly going to get worse in the weeks and months to come as we sort of, as the government. It depends on the government's attitude, whether the government is going to change its attitude toward the devolves or not. But none of that means that it is inevitable that the United Kingdom falls apart. But what it does mean is it's far harder to predict whether or not the United Kingdom in its current shape will exist in 20 years' time.
Great. So you're sticking to the greater turbulence for the time being on that front.
I just think, if you think about, the elections in Scotland, and if the SNP get a majority, and then there's a sort of standoff between the Scottish Parliament and the UK government, with the Scottish Parliament saying they have and one of the things that's interesting here is some Scottish Conservatives have been saying, vote Conservative to avoid an independence referendum. And you can bet your bottom dollar that if the SNP secure a majority in early May, they will turn to Boris Johnson and say, hang on a sec, your own people were telling the Scottish people that if we won this election, we could have an independence referendum. So they will try and push the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, all the indications are, will refuse that referendum. So there'll be increased turbulence in that relationship. And of course, with the protocol and the marching season coming up, then, it's easy to see further turbulence in Northern Ireland.
Super, thank you. You finished the lecture in the area of foreign policy, and Adrian Turner asks, well, what does global Britain actually mean in the 21st century?
Well, seeing as the government hasn't defined it, I don't think it's my place to define it necessarily. I think, one of the things, actually, let's take a historical parallel. When France left NATO, the integrated military structures in 1966, one of the things the French did very, very quickly was become far more activist on the world stage. And they became actually far more rhetorically committed to their allies than many would argue they had been beforehand. Why? Because they wanted to fight the perception that leaving NATO meant a turning back in on themselves. I think we will see a period of hyperactivity in British foreign policy for a similar reason, because the government are determined to show that Brexit doesn't mean we've lost global influence or we're turning our backs on the world. We can argue, we can argue about the relevance or the practicalities of an Indo-Pacific tilt, the specific elements that the government is fleshing out. But I certainly think that the government is going to be active in foreign relations and is going to want to make a splash in foreign relations. The other thing I would say is the government is going to continue to be desperate to sign trade deals with other countries, not because of their economic impact, but because they're quite keen to hold up these pieces of paper and say, you see, we told you we could sign trade deals after Brexit, in the hope that politically the simple fact of having the agreements rather than the details of what the agreements say will be vote winners for them.
I'm going to jump to a question that's also to do with this global relations in some respects, from Catherine Garters. Is the UK less or more safe following departure from the EU?
I think equally would be my answer off the top of my head, because of course our security was preserved first and foremost by NATO. When it comes to territorial security, NATO was the only game in town. The EU has a very limited role when it comes to, that's badly timed, sorry, when it comes to That was actually my computer making the noise, not my phone. My phone is on silent, I promise. I've forgotten where I was now. So NATO is the primary guarantor of our security. The EU performs a securitizing function, particularly via enlargement, which I think is absolutely fundamental. But that will continue even with our absence. I mean, well, you could argue, I suppose you could argue at the margins that the EU is going to be far less keen on enlarging without the UK, because we were one of the big proponents on enlargement. But I don't see a way in which we become less secure. I can see a way, for instance, well, actually, yes, I can see one way in which we become less secure. So let me give you one example. The UK government has taken quite a hard line on China, okay? When we were a member state of the European Union, if the Chinese had wanted to retaliate against us, particularly using economic tools, they would have had to retaliate against 28 states, because we were in a single market and a customs union. Now, if the Chinese want to retaliate against us, they can retaliate against just us. So in that sense, in our vulnerability to reprisals from other countries, we're in a slightly weaker situation, because they don't have to ponder the pros and cons of dealing with the European Union as a whole.
Super, thank you. Erin Nelson's asking a question on the gender dimension of Brexit, and will Brexit impact on the financial security of women in the UK? I think she's working on an MA dissertation in this area. So are there relevant findings from your projects in that area?
My hunch, the short answer is no. I can't think of anything that we've done in that area. We've done things on gender and the polling. I've not seen anything on the economics of gender and Brexit. My hunch is that those gender impacts will be dwarfed by the ones imposed by COVID. I think the gender impacts of COVID are going to be absolutely enormous. And actually, this is one of the issues for economists at the moment, is whether it is possible at all to disentangle the impacts of COVID and of Brexit at the moment. And many of the economists I've spoken to simply say no. So I'm sorry, that was a really rubbish answer, which was basically, I don't know. But it will be, I suppose I would sort of defend myself by saying it's going to be very hard to know now because of those overwhelming COVID impacts.
And I think that was a broader theme that came through in your presentation as well. The longer term economics impacts of Brexit are also going to be clouded and impacted by the effects of COVID as well, isn't it? Super, lovely. We're going on to a question from Adrian Turner. Whose reputation has been enhanced by Brexit? The Ivan Rogers or the Prime Minister?
Well, both their reputations have been enhanced amongst the people who think that they're right, I would say, which might be a bit of a cop-out, but this is one of the things, isn't it? You'd have to struggle to increase your reputation on both sides of the Brexit divide these days. Very, very few people are capable of doing that. I think Boris Johnson has enhanced his reputation amongst a number of people. I mean, not least, think about those people who never in their wildest dreams thought they'd vote Tory. Boris Johnson has enhanced and extended the appeal of the Conservative Party into places, admittedly, where Mrs May had already made headway in 2017, but into constituencies where 5 years ago the Tories wouldn't have bothered campaigning very hard. Ivan Rogers, I mean, that letter is well worth reading and rereading. I mean, you need to have a lot of time to read Ivan's lectures because none of them are very short. I'd have been at half time in my lecture if I was Ivan and just stopping for a bit of orange before starting on the second 45 minutes. But he's a very, very wise man, Ivan. He knows his stuff. And, I would encourage you all to read it. But, in a sense, this is the distinction between rational analysis and politics. They're very, very different worlds. And one of those people is good at one and one of those people is good at the other.
Super, thank you. Turning to economic factors, Wyn Hughes from our business school asks, to what extent will economic factors, for instance, the shortfall in revenue of some 1,700 per person reported in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago, have an effect on the level of support for Scottish independence?
That's almost beyond my pay grade. A lot of it depends on how it's spun. And that's true of politics across the UK. I'm not trying to avoid the Scottish thing, but another example comes to mind, which is some recent polling showed that people still expect local government to provide a whole range of services and blame local government for not, even if some of those services have been cut as the result of cuts imposed by central government on local council budgets. The key to any financial or discussion around Scotland and what it means for relations between Edinburgh and London is who most effectively manages to blame the other side for it. The SNP have had a remarkable track record to date at taking credit for the good things in Scotland and blaming everything bad on London. There are some signs that that might not be working as effectively as it has in the past. But I think ultimately, in terms of the politics, it's who gets a narrative that resonates.
Super. Alan Vance is picking up on your point about the way in which the Conservatives are managing the tensions with the EU. I said that given there are no votes to be gained or lost in Northern Ireland, is there any incentive for the government to make the Northern Ireland Protocol work?
Firstly, I mean, there are not only are there no votes in Northern Ireland, but I'll refer you to a poll that was carried by the Sunday Times in January of this year, which showed a staggering proportion of the English, I think it was over 50%, either wouldn't mind or would be happy in the event of a united Ireland. I mean, it was an absolutely eye-watering poll. If you Google Northern Ireland poll Sunday Times, it will come up. But yes, despite that, yes, there is an incentive. And there is an incentive because I think it was certainly true when Michael Gove was in charge. I think it's still true with David Frost in charge. There is no alternative to the protocol. There is nothing. I mean, you know, it might be the protocol in its current form cannot be made to work, in which case they'll need to revisit it. But something like the protocol has to be there because you need specific arrangements for Northern Ireland if the United Kingdom isn't either in the European Union or in the single market or the customs union, or if you don't want to border down the centre of Ireland, which neither the UK nor the European Union want. And they both said they'll do everything in their powers to prevent it. So what the UK government wants is for the protocol to work on its terms. What the European Union wants is for the protocol to work on its terms. I think the government could have done with and can still do with being a hell of a lot more honest about what it signed up to. I equally think the European Union should start thinking about being a bit more flexible when it comes to implementation. I can't believe, for instance, I don't want to get into the weeds on this, but I can't believe, for instance, there isn't a way of using technology and audit to make sure that plants sold from Great Britain to Northern Ireland end up in Northern Ireland shops rather than crossing the border into the Republic. There must be ways of ensuring that. But at the moment, there's a bit of a standoff, and we still don't have any real sign of which side is going to blink first, though I detect a bit of a change of tone and a willingness on the part of the two sides to actually talk now, which was more than was the case a few months ago.
Super, thank you. Nicholas Perdikis from our business school asks, how do you think the UK's foreign trade policy will evolve, given that regulatory frameworks are now more important than tariffs and quotas?
I think in one sense, trade policy is, I mean, to use a word I use of the Prime Minister, a little bit performative. That is to say that what matters politically for this government is not so much what trade deals say, as the fact of having them and being able to wave them around and say, see, global Britain signing trade deals left, right and centre. You're absolutely right. Trade deals now, and, you know, think back to that leaked government forecast that I showed you. Trade deals now have to be about regulations more than they have to be about tariffs, because tariffs are very low globally. Tariffs are very, very low. There was one LSE study 3 years ago that showed if we scrapped every single tariff on trade between us and the United States, it would benefit the UK economy by about 0.3% of GDP. Whether or not this government is willing to enter into the sort of negotiations that are necessary to sign regulatory agreements, which of course by definition imply restrictions on your freedom of movement, not on freedom of movement, but on your freedom to regulate as you wish. So if you're trying to come to regulatory agreements, you have to make guarantees about what your regulations are going to be in future, and those will be overseen by some sort of body. Those were precisely the reasons why Boris Johnson and co wanted to leave the European Union. External control over British laws. So I'm not sure we're going to get much further than memorandums of understanding, determination to work together, and a few tariff cuts in the majority of trade deals that we sign.
Super, thank you. I can hear your voice, but your camera seems to have frozen, but we'll carry on.
Embarrassing. It does that every now and again in the most humiliating position possible, but I've turned it back on, so I might reappear. Have I reappeared?
Not yet, you will. Okay. Are you happy to continue with the question?
I make a lot more sense when I'm invisible.
Can we go to France? Are you happy to go to France?
Good, I'd love to go to France. I'd love to go to London at this point. I'm in Oxford.
So you talked about UK relations with France and with Germany in particular, and the impending presidential election in France, where Marine Le Pen at present seems to be leading in the polls. How might this affect Anglo-EU relations? And is it possible that Brexit may become contagious? So 2 questions there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my camera says it's on, but it's clearly not because I can't see myself. I don't know what's happening. I mean, I think my computer is fed up of lockdown too at this point. But several questions there. Firstly, what I would say is take the polls in France, particularly polls to do with the second round, with with 10 packets of salt. They're rubbish. They're absolutely rubbish. You're asking people about a hypothetical after a hypothetical. Assuming these two get to the second round, who will you vote for? People are doing all sorts of signalling at this point, not least their dissatisfaction with Macron. I still think that the French have rigged their electoral system very successfully to the point where it is highly unlikely that Marine Le Pen would win. I think the real threat for President Macron is not losing to her in the second round. It is failing to get through the first round, which he only did by a couple of percent last time round. And that will depend on the number of candidates, the split across the political spectrum and so on. Would a Marine Le Pen presidency affect Anglo-French relations? Far less off the top of my head than they would affect the European Union. I think it would be devastating for the European Union to have someone like Marine Le Pen in the European Council, because the whole point of the European Union for her and for her electoral base would be to go there and say, I'm standing up for France, we're not sharing with anyone. It could bring the workings of the European Union to a halt. Bear in mind, France is the only member state that has ever brought the European Union to a halt with the empty chair crisis in 1965. Can we be emulated? I think it's incredibly unlikely for several reasons. Firstly, support for EU membership has gone up across the board in the member states post-Brexit. For some reason, they thought that Brexit didn't look quite as easy as we'd said it was going to be. Secondly, most EU member states are small member states. Small member states don't generally leave big clubs because big clubs make them feel secure. Thirdly, the majority of member states are in the euro, and if you think Brexit was messy, try doing it while changing your currency at the same time. It would be an absolute horror show. And the final thing I would say is I think we were always a bit of an outlier in the European Union, and for many reasons, and one of them was the European Union never entered the DNA of our politics in the way it has done for all the other member states. For the UK, European integration was an economic project that we pursued for economic reasons. For every other member state, European integration is an economic project they pursue for political reasons. For the original 6, it was to prevent war. For the southern European states, it was to enshrine the move from dictatorship to democracy. For the East European states, it's about turning their backs on Russia and rejoining the European family. So I think, even the French, and God knows the French don't need any lessons from us about nationalism. When the French president gives a press conference, there are 2 flags behind him. And even that would be inconceivable under any prime minister, or maybe Ted Heath, but in this country. So I think for a variety of reasons, I just do not see any chance in the short to medium term of emulation.
So greater stability over in the EU, at least. A question now from Milia Kurki, a professor in the Department of International Politics, and she asks, what are the challenges in relation to official development aid for the UK now, and what is your view regarding recent cuts in this regard?
I regret the cuts. I think it is counterproductive. I think at a time when we should be looking to shore up the UK's reputation, this does the opposite. Manifold challenges now, one of which is getting the same bang for the buck as we did when we were engaged in conversations about development aid in a body of 27 other member states as well. The second, I think, is the real danger of aid becoming excessively politicized. We need to keep a specifically aid-based rationale behind our aid policy. The danger, I think, within the Foreign Office, though some in the Foreign Office see this as an opportunity, is that aid becomes far more explicitly tied to the pursuit of foreign policy objectives rather than given to places that are genuinely in need. So for me, that is the thing to watch. What happens to our aid giving now that they're explicitly under the direction of the Foreign Office? I mean, it could work very well, actually. You could end up with foreign policy and aid being mutually reinforcing in places that need the aid, but of course it could go the other way as well. I'm sorry about my camera. I'm at a loss as to what to do, but if anyone wants to send a question in telling me what to do, then that would be great.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear, so that's great. So a question here from Mark Heslop. Do you think we will ever return to the European fold as part of the EU or as a future version of it?
Not in the foreseeable future, I don't think, because it's hard to see either of the big parties having that as a policy. And that is a sort of necessary but not sufficient condition, I think, for us to go back in. The Labour Party want to talk about everything but Brexit. I suspect that might be the case after the next election as well, because the sort of cultural divide among the Labour electorate isn't going to go away. And, you know, the EU is one of the big issues that triggers that divide. So I find it very hard to see politically how it gets back on the agenda, let alone how it gets back on the agenda forcefully enough for someone to countenance the possibility of us having another referendum. The other thing I should add, of course, is the terms on which we rejoined, if we were to rejoin, which I don't think we will be very different to the terms we rejected via David Cameron's renegotiation, because I can tell you now there'll be no budget rebate, and I'd be very, very surprised if there were opt-outs from Schengen or the euro available to us in the event we tried to rejoin.
Therefore, it would be a requirement to, you know, enter as any other member state who would try to apply now. Okay, I think we're coming to the last set of questions. Raya Zweliger, who's a professor at the university, asks, what does this mean in the long term for EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU? And to note, I am an EU citizen in the UK.
Well, if you've got settled status, it means one set of things. If you've arrived too late to get settled status, it's far, far more serious. Actually, for me, the interesting case is UK citizens in the EU, because they lose a whole load of rights, not least the right to free movement. You know, if you're an EU citizen in the UK, I think you pretty much maintain the rights you had under settled status, and you maintain the right of freedom of movement. UK citizens enjoy the rights in the country in which they're resident. So there are issues about UK citizens who live in one EU member state but work in another, say. People who work in Luxembourg and live in a neighbouring country are going to face particular issues. You know, it obviously it has a huge impact on people in general, to sort of broaden the question out a little bit, with the need for work visas and all those kind of things, making life a lot more complicated. I was talking to someone from one of the broadcasters the other day who was saying that they were going off to do, very excited about going off to do a shoot in Spain. Until they realised they actually had to go into the Spanish embassy or a Spanish consulate to get papers stamped and signed and stuff like this. And it was a real eye-opener for me. It just makes life a hell of a lot more complicated. I mean, I can't wait till Roger Daltrey actually is allowed to tour again, at which point he'll realise not only that he needs a visa, but also he needs to register his instruments, and also that if he goes by bus, after 2 stops, he's going to have to come home because the rules of cabotage means he can't keep on going around the European Union. So actually, one of the interesting things about this issue, the broader issue of citizens rather than just the necessarily UK citizens there or EU citizens here, is we have not yet confronted some of the major personal impacts of Brexit because we're in lockdown. It's when we start traveling, it's when the accountants and the architects and the musicians start wanting to go and ply their trade in the European Union again, that the full implications of the deal we've signed up to will become clear.
Great. And another effect really of Brexit, you know, weakening the direct impacts that we're seeing, COVID weakening the direct and immediate impacts that we're seeing as a result of Brexit. At the moment, at least.
And bear in mind, I mean, there are credible reports that say the European Union offered us the typical mobility package that they offer in March of last year, which was an across-the-board 90-day stay visa-free, even if you're going for work. The UK government rejected it. The gossip is the UK government rejected it because the Home Office had one look at it and thought it smelt a bit of free movement and was politically unacceptable.
Thank you. Can I jump in with one question, which is, you talked about the shift from the left-right dimension dominating voter choice to thinking about social liberalism and social conservatism. Mm-hmm. How do you factor identity and national identity there as well in terms of the new divides in the UK?
I mean, the best advice I can give you there is to read the book by Ailsa Henderson and Richard Wynne-Jones on Englishness, because it doesn't factor into that split. And I'm guilty of what they sort of argue David Cameron was guilty of in 2016, which is overlooking the specific national issues that underlie some of these things. So one of the arguments they make that really resonated with me, actually, is David Cameron fought the 2015 general election by stressing the dangers of division and stressing the dangers of Ed Miliband controlled by Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond. Do you remember that famous poster? But he led a campaign for Remain that was blind to national difference. And in fact, a disproportionate number of the people who spoke at the national debates on Brexit, as you recall, were Scottish. And this was not a way to appeal to English, sort of middle England, who felt slightly resentful about the deal the Scots get anyway. So it is absolutely fundamental, I think. It doesn't layer on neatly into the kind of analysis I did. But I think, you know, if you were doing a far more nuanced job than I did in my lecture, then absolutely it needs to be fed in, because these things shape attitudes quite profoundly. You know, being a supporter of Scottish independence would have shaped your attitude towards Brexit.
Superb, thank you.
I'm not answering a lot of questions, I'm aware of that, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to be honest.
Just to say that we're not sure, they've tried to investigate and resolve the camera issue this side, and we think it might be a local issue, but we're hearing you very well. Right,
I mean, it is weird, my camera light is on, and this is, you know, as ever, this is a system I've never used before, your system, so I daren't press any of the numerous buttons I see in front of me in case something goes really wrong.
Super. Colin, would you like to ask the question?
Yes, I mean, the question I had is, to a certain extent, being asked by Milia Kirky, and that is, if the British government was trying to make a splash about global Britain, about moving on from Brexit into a bright new future, why on earth did it make the spectacular own goal of cutting overseas development aid, even if it's only for 1 year? Because the ramifications of this in many of the countries who you want to start to develop new relations with are really quite profound and dramatic. So was this simply a case of pandering to the Tory backbenches? Was it a case of not thinking it through? Or is there some cunning plan there which we're not yet aware of?
I think it caused a lot of consternation amongst the Conservative backbenchers, to be perfectly honest. I'm not convinced by that as a motive. I think the numbers who were cheering were far smaller than the numbers who expressed concern. For me, the trade-off was between, if we want to sort of win friends and influence people, the trade-off was that we do that better by spending more on defence and therefore less on development. I mean, it was almost a straight transfer, wasn't it, in terms of the amounts from development to defence. So that was clearly a decision that they took. Look, we need to beef up defence because, and I imagine that at some point there was a rational conversation about the fact that actually post-Brexit Britain can do more to sort of win friends by spending more on defence than we can by maintaining the aid commitment. But as I said, I think it's a real shame they did it.
Thank you. Ellen, I don't know for any more questions, but I do note that we were aiming at a 9 o'clock finish, and we're getting close to 9 o'clock. So, are any more questions?
I can't see any more questions. We've gone. I think we've done a good job of going through the questions, to be honest. And I think we've had some questions on similar themes. So what I did was select the first question on that theme, and there were a bit of overlap with some questions. So thank you very much for those who've contributed questions. A great set, and I think a great range of questions reflecting the richness and breadth of the lecture as well.
Thanks, Ellen. So I began this lecture, my introductory comments, by commenting upon the tradition of public lectures at Aberystwyth in addressing contemporary challenges. And then Anand immediately pointed out in his lecture that Brexit was not simply going to be a contemporary challenge, but one which will be with us for the future as well. And at that point, I sort of had this sort of binary reaction. Had a reaction as a member of the general public of groaning that we're going to be living with Brexit for even longer. And then the cheering as a political scientist that Brexit has been one of the most interesting political developments in the UK over the past decades, certainly for as long as I've been involved in studying politics, and more to come sounds like a jolly good thing for me. And certainly for more lectures such as one which Anand has delivered tonight. I must say, though, that one of the things which depresses me most about the whole Brexit thing, and many things do, is the situation in Northern Ireland. And as somebody who was involved on the periphery of the Good Friday Agreement, it seems to me that the situation there is far more precarious than anyone imagined during the course of the Brexit referendum. And this was a failure of foresight for many people. Can I thank, first of all, Ellen Royals for handling, for organising the questions so fantastically and for agreeing to do that. Can I thank Sarah and the team working the system and training Ellen, Anand and myself in how to use the system. But above all, can I thank Anand Menon for starting this series with such a fantastic lecture. I've known Anand, as is obvious, for a number of years now, and I knew he would give a great lecture. But this was, I think, an absolutely fantastic lecture. So, Anand, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really do look forward to buying you a drink here in Aberystwyth and hopefully a meal as well. So thank you all very much for attending. I think one of the most pleasing things is I've been monitoring the attendance throughout, and until the last couple of minutes when I've started to talk, the attendance has remained solid. And this indicates, I think, the way in which people